So again, thank you for joining us today for Assessing First-Year Students, a conversation on assessment techniques. Our presenters will share different assessment techniques using qualitative and quantitative methods to assess first-year students in the areas of instruction, user experiences, programming, and more. I'd now like to introduce Ray Pun, first-year student success librarian at California State University, Fresno, and Katelyn Angell, assistant professor and first-year success librarian from Long Island University. Go ahead and take it away, guys.
Thanks, Olga. We wanted to also ask everyone here in this first poll, if you will, in the chat box, if you can just type in your location, where in the world are you? We're just curious to see where everyone's from.
All right, we're getting a good mix across the U.S. I see Arizona, North Carolina, Texas, New York, South Carolina, New Orleans, Indiana. We've got our first Canadian at British Columbia, Oklahoma. Pretty widespread. That's fantastic. Lots of different states.
Wow, that's really exciting. I usually have done some webinars where we have international attendees, and just curious, Canadians coming into this webinar. That's really good. I think we've had people from China and India who came on before. Well, thank you for typing in and sharing your location. So we're just going to get started. We want to thank Credo and Olga and the team for giving us this opportunity to present on this really exciting area that I think most of you or all of you might find to be useful and helpful. I wanted to say that we are not necessarily like key experts in these areas. I think what you'll find is that these are some practices and techniques that you can adapt into your own practice. Hopefully you'll be inspired. We dug around different literature, and Kate has a lot to share, and I'll be learning throughout the webinar as well. Very excited to let you know about these activities we've done. And I will admit, I haven't done all of these assessments, but what we found is that they are pretty implementable in a sense that you can just do it in your one-shots or your own students or in your embedded programming. And so the other thing that's really interesting I want to mention is that they are really great for presenting and publishing. So for instance, you are trying to gather this data, obviously to improve your services, but you can also design these techniques for publication purposes or just trying to present it in a conference. So it might help you, especially those who are in tenure track situations, to get some research out there. And we aren't really going to go over anything really complex. So don't expect any like multiple linear regressions or ANCOVA and NOVAs, any of that. We'll just actually go over like really basics, but also really in-depth look at how the literature and the case studies support it. So I wanted to just mention that. And so introductions again, I'm Ray Pun, first-year student success librarian at Fresno State in California. I support students in information literacy, student engagement programming for first years, transfers, and incoming international students.
Hello, and I'm Katelyn Angell, and I'm the first-year success librarian at LIU-Brooklyn, and I work in a very similar capacity as Ray.
And we're really excited because for a number of reasons, many of you, I just want to pitch this out there, might be familiar with the Institute of Research Design Librarianship, the IRDL. I participated in 2016, and I know Kate knows some people who have participated as well. The deadline is January, sometime in January of next year. So it's coming up soon. So it's sort of like a lot of these different methods you learn in that kind of boot camp that I realize what we're discussing will be aligned to some of the experiences you have over there. And it's a really great program. So to start off with the program, this webinar, I wanted to mention that it really came down to this document. For those of you who may not be familiar with this came from ACRL that was released with OCLC to really investigate how libraries support student learning and success and effectively communicate the values to higher education. They really bring up different kinds of case studies, talking points, research questions to consider, and an approach that is like using mixed methods, so qualitative and quantitative studies. And what's interesting is that for those of you who really don't know where to start or where to begin, this is a great document to explore and see what was conducted, how they conducted it, OCLC, reaching out to different senior members of universities such as the provost, and getting that feedback. But what's really interesting is the research questions that they give out in terms of areas to consider to grow. So those research questions you can actually adapt as your own and then localize it in your context. And how would you do that? Well, you'll be able to possibly use some of our techniques we'll share today to give you more ideas and inspiration. And this document is free. If you just search Academic Library Impact, it's an open document that you can just download freely online through ACRL. So this whole webinar will consist of these three formats. We're going to talk about formative and summative assessment, what's the difference, and which one you might want to consider. Qualitative and quantitative research methods, different approaches, and we'll be embedding different kinds of case studies and resources at the end that you can look further and understand in context. So first we want to do a, oh, sorry, this is Kate's.
Oh, that's okay. So first we'll begin with a poll. We'll have 4 polls today. And our first one, if you could please respond, is are you familiar with summative or formative assessments? If you could please select one of the options, we'll give you a couple minutes. Thank you. Okay, everybody, so our results are in. At this point, 42% of people are familiar with summative or formative assessments, 35% of people somewhat, and 22% of people, this is a new topic. And so we'll begin discussing those in detail, and Ray will start by talking about formative assessment.
That's right. Well, this is really interesting. I wasn't sure what the results would be, but I will explain really briefly here. Formative assessment is really these 3 key points, right? Informing students, emphasizing feedback, and high level of learning. So what that means is the goal of formative assessment is to monitor student learning to provide ongoing feedback that can be used by instructors or librarians to improve their teaching and for students to improve their learning. So think of it like this. You can do formative assessment in a one-shot or a general workshop where you can break down your presentation into quizzes, informal polling, 1-minute reflection, or some sort of a quick write where students have to reflect what they learned, or some sort of mobile app that you can use to generate participation, or even think, pair, share, having students think through a problem, talk about it, and then share it. So what these activities do is that they really help inform and guide their own learning, and then they share that feedback with you. So maybe something isn't really clear in the quiz or in the reflection that you can use to improve your teaching, or you can understand that most of the students are understanding it, but some aren't. And so it really goes both ways. And so I see formative assessment in that kind of context, and those are some activities that you can consider.
Okay, and I'll be talking about summative assessment. And unlike formative assessment, which is usually ongoing within a learning environment, summative assessment is cumulative, and it focuses on what students have learned at the end of a specific period of instruction, such as the end of the semester. It's generally measured over a longer period of time, and therefore it's more high stakes for students in terms of grading than formative assessment is. Common examples of it in higher ed include midterm exams or final presentations. It can reveal students' comprehension of course material at the time of the assessment, determine how prepared they are for advancement in a particular field of study, or even to offer career guidance. In terms of academic librarianship, I have an example. Radom and Gammons developed a summative assessment tool for one-shot English composition library sessions. They taught students information evaluation skills by using the 5 Ws commonly employed in journalism. 3 weeks after the one-shot, students were sent an online survey to assess student retention and application of the evaluation method. The survey's goal was to evaluate if predetermined student learning outcomes were reached. The prevalence of the one-shot library instruction session poses a special challenge for effective summative assessment at the classroom level. The main beneficiary of this style of assessment would be students enrolled in future library sessions. Formative assessment, with its potential to be actively incorporated into the classroom during the teaching process, can help fill this gap. Summative assessment would be a particularly viable option for librarians who teach a semester-long information literacy course. Thanks, Ray.
And so hopefully this will give you some context of summative and formative assessment, and then we're going to actually break it down into the different case studies you'll see later. And so before we move on, we just have this other poll. We love really polling. These are formative assessments, if you will. We're just trying to like gauge and see where people are coming from. Do you often conduct qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods for assessment? So if you don't do any, actually we didn't have that option now that I think about it, but I'm sure there's some kind of assessment you're doing, maybe for your own research or so forth. You can choose one of the responses. All right, this is very cool. We got, actually can't see the number. Kate, can you see the number?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So for qualitative methods, 25% of people use. Quantitative methods, 11% of people use. And then 64%, about 2/3 of people use mixed methods for assessment.
Thanks, Kate. Wow, that's really great. So we'll be talking about a combination of both of them to give you some context. And so for those who are not familiar with qualitative and quantitative, really want to just break it down here. Like which method would you prefer using? Well, it depends on what you're trying to study. It depends on your research question, on your student learning outcomes, and so forth. But for those who are thinking about qualitative, who often use quantitative, you might want to consider qualitative because it emphasizes on natural settings, observations, verbal narratives, interpretations, and experiences, things you can't really necessarily measure. And it also builds on theory and captures the behavior of the experiences of the moment of your participants. For quantitative methods, really emphasizes on numbers, measurements, really about control and experimentation. And in some senses, it may test hypotheses, establish facts, or tries to make correlation or prediction using statistics. So either way, I think for those who have said they do mixed methods, that's really interesting, and we're going to ask later about your approaches. But for now, we wanted to discuss these areas. So I'll pass this to Kate.
Okay, thanks, Ray. And so I'll begin talking about t-tests, a type of quantitative assessment. My favorite book on statistics, which is the SPSS Survival Manual by Julie Plant, gives a good and simple explanation of t-tests. She writes, t-tests are used when you have two groups or two sets of data and you wish to compare the mean score on some continuous variable. So for example, for our purposes, a population could be all of the first-year students at your university, and a sample could be 40 students enrolled in 2 first-year seminar classes. T-tests are very popular and easy to run in a statistical software product such as SPSS or SAS, and I've used SPSS primarily in my own practice. There are 2 primary types of t-tests, independent sample and paired sample. You can use independent sample t-tests to compare scores between 2 different groups of people. Here you gather data from 2 different groups on a single occasion. An example from the library literature can be found in a recent article by Alberillo. He used independent sample t-tests to compare assessment data from a library tutorial among English language learners and non-English language learners. He found that on average, non-English language learners received higher scores on the measurement, but English language learners reported it as more useful. And the other type is called paired samples t-tests, also known as repeated measures. And these entail testing the same group of participants at 2 distinct points in time, sometimes after an intervention. With a paired samples t-test, you can examine differences in scores across time. My coworker Raymond Pun and I conducted paired samples t-tests in a study we conducted in 2015. We were interested to see if students taught with games relating to citing and keyword development skills would perform better on an assessment tool than students in a control group. We gave a pre-test to both groups, then had one group play games in the classroom, which was our intervention, and then we gave a post-test to both groups. Our paired sample t-test determined that students who use the games receive significantly higher scores. The website lynda.com, and that's Lynda with a Y as in yellow, offers many user-friendly online classes on learning to use different statistical products. A monthly individual subscription is about $20, and your workplace might even have an institutional subscription, which would allow you to take these classes free of charge. Thanks, Ray.
Well, that sounds really great. I also think, most of us are familiar with, or at least know about SPSS, data, SAS. I'm aware that I think with SAS, if you are affiliated with a university, you should be able to get a basic version to download and to use. But I also wanted to add that with t-tests, I think for those who are doing a lot of instruction, you might want to think of a pre and a post test on that same workshop. So to really assess almost like a formative assessment, so it's tied into a t-test. You just need to take out that data and then measure it across time. And it's almost can be a quantitative or qualitative study, actually, now that I think about it, because you can have, if you're doing a focus group, you can have different conversations and then again to sort of test it out. But for statistically measurements, I think doing a pre and post test survey would work really well. And we wanted to talk about this other area, correlations. So correlations coefficient is used in statistics when determining the relationship between two variables that are continuous. So what are these variables that are continuous? Something that's measurable. For instance, age, grade, price of textbooks, something that has a scale to it, right? And when you have these variables, you're able to determine the relationship. Like, for example, if you're trying to determine the relationship between the average GPA of all the students and the time they spend in the library, it might be positive, negative, or non-existent, the correlation, based on the data that you can get and then plug into SPSS or some statistical tool. And so it's something for you to think about how this works. Katelyn?
Thanks, Ray. Due to their popularity within the higher education assessment, it's worthwhile for me to discuss key aspects of rubric creation. Several academic librarians have documented their experience creating, validating, and applying rubrics, including myself. An important part of rubric development is ensuring that a rubric is both valid and reliable before putting it to use in the classroom. Briefly defined, reliability means that a tool is consistent across applications, and validity means that a tool measures what it is intended to measure. There are multiple types of validity and reliability, but two prevalent in rubric development will be discussed today: inter-rater reliability and construct validity. Earlier this year, Van Halver and colleagues described their process for making sure their scoring rubric for information literacy was both valid and reliable. They used the interclass correlation coefficient, also known as the ICC, to calculate inter-rater reliability, which is the level of agreement among raters. This is really important if you're going to be creating rubrics with other librarians to learn about inter-rater reliability. The researchers also used the Pearson correlation to determine criterion validity. Criterion validity measures if scores on the assessment tool in question match with scores of a related tool that was designed to measure the same construct. So these are complex topics. I myself still need periodic refreshers every time I make a new rubric. So really any introductory social research methods or statistics textbook will have some good basic information about these topics. And now Ray will talk about Pearson correlations.
That's right. Thanks, Kate. So this case study I'll just mention briefly is really interesting because I was going through the literature and I was thinking, wow, this is an interesting way to study the correlation between academic performance and library material usage, because that's what we're all trying to prove these days, right? Like, how do we help students in retention, success, and measure that using the data that we've gathered or the data that can be meaningful to describe what we can do better or what is working right now. So this case study, I would just mention that is something for you to look into. It came from a university, I'm trying to remember now, I think it's in Hong Kong, and there's so many that I was going through. And what's great is that they really draw out that correlation. And it's a good example for you to adapt, maybe in your institution, meaning that you might want to follow their procedures and then their methods, and then see if you can design a similar correlation study. So now we are in this third poll. This is something I think will be interesting for the audience members to see the results as well. What are some challenges you face with assessment? And these are the options: not enough time, no direction, overwhelming, all the above, or something else. So hopefully there's one that really stands out that you can relate to. And so that will give us some ideas of what are the challenges people are facing these days with assessment. All right, Kate, do you mind telling me the numbers?
I'd be happy to. So now for our poll results, some challenges people face with assessment. So 22% of people said that there was not enough time. 17% of people reported no direction. 13% of people said that it was overwhelming. 37% of the people said all of the above, and 11% of people had a different answer that was not in the multiple choice.
Ooh, that's interesting. Thank you for filling that poll out. I'm curious what the something else is, and I will pass this to Kate.
Thanks, Ray. No, in addition to the quantitative methods we've discussed, there are a number of useful qualitative assessment methods. While I've mostly used quantitative methods within my own research and scholarship, there are some great qualitative assessments that out there in the library literature. One strategy is applying open-ended interviews, as utilized by Wharton, to assess library and resources for an off-campus library patrons in a recent study. Findings from these interviews were translated into direct and immediate plans of action to inform distance services. Pros of this approach include personal contact between the researcher and participant and detailed responses. Cons include the significant time needed to conduct and evaluate the interviews. And I haven't done this myself, but I think that open-ended interviews would be a great way to evaluate information literacy instruction efforts. In addition, there's also the semi-structured interview, which generally includes both open and closed-ended questions. Gross and Latham conducted semi-structured interviews with first-year students to receive important feedback on an information literacy skills workshops that students had attended. The researchers were particularly interested in learning which aspects of the workshop that the students found most beneficial and receiving suggestions for improving its design. You can see their study for the full list of interview questions, and all the studies that we've discussed in this webinar are located in full on our references page. Lastly, another qualitative method is the focus group. Havana used focus groups as one method of assessing the effectiveness of an embedded information literacy module for first-year business students. The point of the focus groups were to solicit direct feedback from students who had participated in the module on their experiences and any changes that they would recommend for future iterations of the partnership. Student feedback can play a major role in identifying problem areas, which can be rectified to improve student learning outcomes. Thanks, Ray.
No, thank you for sharing. And the focus group is really interesting. So if, for example, you're trying to think of what activities other than questions to ask, you might want to try this activity. And for those who have been to some of my previous webinars, I've mentioned this opportunity to do ethnomapping activity where you have students basically draw a map of the library and then you show them your library floor plans and then to compare. So basically what they do is when I do these focus groups with my first year students, I have them draw a map of the library, like the first floor or wherever they might think what the library means, and then they actually write it out and describe what's in it, and then we have a discussion. What they don't know is that there's some things that they might not be aware of. So they might not be aware of certain kinds of service or technology, and then we have a discussion, and then we show them the real map, and it really informs them the detail of resources we have and the services. And in some contexts, you can say it's a formative assessment learning tool that's a qualitative base, because you're making observations. You're trying to see what students are getting at. And it informs you too, because if the students aren't aware that you have laptop loaning programs, because maybe it's just hidden in a corner or it's not advertised well, maybe that's something you need to think about with your library administrator to find ways to promote it. Or if they're not sure of certain areas, whether it's library study spaces, then that's something you can inform them as well. And what I find interesting is that I find out that some of the maps you might see in that picture might not be very detailed. And then I ask, well, I'm just curious, like, do you spend a lot of time in a library? And then they'll tell you, no, I actually don't like to study in the library because it's noisy, because I can't find space, or because I have 3 jobs and I never have time to study in the library. That can give you a lot of good insight to their behavior and how they see the library and that perception. And so from that kind of information, you might think, well, if that's the issue, did you know that we have online resources in case you can access it? You don't have to be in the library to use these databases. And then sometimes they say no, sometimes they say yes. But my whole point is that this activity can be tied into a focus group, or if you want to do a workshop, you can try that. I actually never done it in a workshop, now that I think about it, maybe one workshop, and it was a lot of good and fun discussions, but what's important is you have the students share their experience and then learn from each other. So that sort of informs the high learning process.
That's such a great idea, Ray. I can't wait to share this with my colleagues at LIU-Brooklyn.
Yeah, that's something I'm curious to hear what your results are.
Okay, great. So now I'll talk about assessing the assessor. So in addition to assessing student learning outcomes, it's also important to discuss assessing instruction that students receive. Gerwertz in 2014 describes steps that librarians took at her institution to evaluate and improve their teaching in first-year library instruction sessions. 3 types of assessment were employed here: student feedback, peer-to-peer, and self-reflection. Peer-to-peer encourages librarians to share both successes and challenges, and they can provide each other with new teaching methods or technologies to try. These can also include in-classroom observations where librarians can observe each other teach. Such critical and engaging team discussions can also improve the instruction program at the library as a whole. Student feedback gives librarians valuable insight regarding any content or methods that students perceived as confusing during the library session. This feedback can be solicited in many ways, such as by an anonymous survey, focus groups, which Ray just talked about, or an informal query at the end of an instruction session. Lastly, librarians engaged in self-assessment, such as in a journal or a portfolio, can reflect on any changes that they should make to ensure new library users receive optimal instruction. Thanks, Ray.
Thanks. That sounds really interesting. I'm going to check out Gerwertz and some of the literature you provided. The next one I want to mention is microassessment technique. So this is kind of interesting. You're seeing this and you're thinking, okay, you've seen it in the airports, you've probably seen it in some, I don't know, customer service assessment, but it's a little bit 2 different areas. So let me just explain here that microassessment is really a way to gather feedback using small, short, concise, and actionable survey. So about 3 to 4 questions and using emojis to help users respond. The challenge with using emojis is that there are no standards for emojis in numerical values. So what that means is if you're trying to, you can technically assign a number to each one of them, but it may not be give you that sort of pure value that you might need to describe in a research study. However, the emojis can really get people to respond promptly. As I've seen a lot of case studies that the students seem to respond well with emojis. And it serves as a Likert scale or a Likert scale, however you want to pronounce that. And so what are these questions, right, that you want to ask? So if you are, let's say, curious about the students who come into this area and you just have this little box with surveys and stuff like that, you might have questions like, how likely are you to ask a librarian for help? and you can give them the emojis. And how happy are you with your library experience? So a couple of questions to gauge the sentiment, to understand and measure how they're feeling. And it's just one sort of assessment technique for those who don't have never done any user experience or assessment in general. You might want to just experiment and play with this, and then you can write it up and share with the rest of us later in a publication or presentation how it went or where it went or what you would like to see differently. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It's a little bit an anomaly of all the really statistical methods or qualitative methods we've been going through.
Okay, so now Ray and I will talk about specific tools that you can try in your assessment. So I'll be talking about the first two, and then Ray will describe the next two. So the first is summative, which you might have used in your own instruction. It's a very popular student response tool, and it also has rich potential for formative and summative assessment. Librarians can create and administer quizzes and see student responses in real time. Students can be given a pretest to determine how much prior knowledge they have on a topic, or summative can measure learning comprehension at the end of an instruction session. The product is free for up to 50 students per session, so that's very appealing. And the service also offers smartphone and tablet apps, so students can answer via their devices. There's also an open source quiz bank available, so you can check out quizzes that other librarians have made and use them in your own teaching. I haven't used summative myself, but I've heard positive feedback from multiple colleagues and definitely going to experiment with it soon. However, I have used Poll Everywhere. This is one I would very highly recommend to you. It's also a student response system, and I've used it to quiz students on their knowledge of MLA citing practices using a teaching activity that I developed called America's Next Top Citation. Similar to summative, educators can use Poll Everywhere as an engaging means of collecting student feedback in real time and assessing their learning comprehension. This product definitely helps to facilitate active learning, as I can tell you from my own experience, and it's also free for up to, I believe, about 25 students or so. O'Connor has also written of her experiences using Poll Everywhere as an assessment tool in first-year instruction, and she's used it in two ways. One, to evaluate prior knowledge of basic library resources at the beginning of a one-shot library session, and also to gauge student comprehension at the session's conclusion. And now Ray will talk about two other products, Google Forms and Qualtrics.
That's right. And so I wanted to just add in here for summative, it's really interesting. I teach several workshops during the semester for first year STEM, and the instructors, they use it. Every class, after every class, they have the students fill out the summative, a question or a couple of questions about what they learned today. And so after I did a couple of those workshops in this past fall, there wasn't enough time for the students to do a summative. And then so the professor's like, no, summative, or yes, summative or summative. And so the students were like really excited. They were like, yes, they were like dancing. They were like, no, we don't have to do this, polling this question. I felt really bad for the instructor, but then I understood, talking to the TA who was there. I'm like, oh, why is everybody so excited? They're like, oh yeah, they don't like it. And it's sort of like their exit ticket. But the thing is, it was interesting to see that in action. And that's how I learned about that tool. And I think Poll Everywhere, I've used it once or twice in other capacities, but it's also something I recommend, as Kate mentioned. Now I mentioned a Google Forms, which is, all of you are probably familiar with it. If not, you might want to explore this tool that you can incorporate in your LibGuides or in your instruction. And it's really easy, friendly to design. Formative assessment, almost like a pre and post test, or just a post test where you can see what students learned and what else they can share about their research or information that you can gather. I just want to mention that because that's often something that people have used to design maybe tutorials or any kind of a survey that they can send out. Qualtrics, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's really sophisticated tool, pretty expensive. And for those who are in smaller universities, I will acknowledge that it is really something that if you can't maximize it, it's kind of really challenging, right, to get that data. But what's great is that it can really do a lot of assessment, like remind participants to fill out a survey and get that data and really analyze it for you. And you can export that information to SPSS or Excel and so forth. But I wanted to mention, because of the price, you might want to look into different departments in your university. Like, for example, maybe your Office of Institutional Effectiveness or that statistical gathering department you might have, or even stats or academic technology services, because they may have a subscription to Qualtrics, and you may want to collaborate with an instructor or a professor there and really utilize it. If your library or your institution maybe doesn't have it, there might be a local license. So that's something to keep in mind. Or if you have research funds, maybe you can get a trial subscription and then see what it's like. But generally, I see a lot of people using Google Forms because it's more accessible and easy to design. But I think Qualtrics can also be very, very powerful to administer like a t-test, a pre and post test, and you can just use it for statistical studies as well.
And I just have one thing to add, Ray. I've had really good luck with Google Forms in my own assessment, and I would especially recommend, if you wish to use this, it's very helpful if you send your tool to the teaching faculty member that you're partnering with, and you ask if this person would be okay with forwarding your assessment tool to their students. A lot of times that's how I've been able to do assessment, is by sending the teaching faculty the tool, and the students will then receive it and then fill it out. So just a pointer from my own work.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, so now we'll talk about two more tools that you can use for assessment. One is ePortfolios. And so this platform for assessment of student learning never occurred to me until I started researching for this webinar. So I've learned a lot through doing today's webinar. ePortfolios. They're prevalent in higher education as a means of helping students to document their learning process and to showcase the final products for both educational and professional purposes. In 2014, Giantini and Venturini reported on an innovative partnership between their library and an academic department. Rubrics were created collaboratively, and they were used to assess student assignments that were housed in ePortfolios. Because these ePortfolios contain a rich and varied collection of student work across a semester, they can be an ideal instrument for assessing learning outcomes. Combining the resources of teaching and library faculty also ensure that both discipline-related and information literacy skills are evaluated. Then we could not do a webinar on assessment without talking about rubrics. I'd wager to guess that when asked which assessment method you would name as most commonly used in libraries, most people would probably say rubrics. For people who are not familiar with a rubric, it's comprised of clearly defined criteria and descriptive levels of performance, and it's used to evaluate student learning and to offer students productive and concrete feedback. There are two primary types of rubrics, holistic and analytical. An analytical rubric is much more detailed in terms of learning objectives and scoring, and it's the type I've seen most frequently within library literature. It's also the type that I've usually used myself. There are many benefits to using rubrics as an assessment tool. These include grading objectivity across multiple raters and across time, as well as a way of providing students with concrete and objective feedback that they can use to improve their skills. Rubrics are used to assess a multitude of information literacy assignments within academic libraries, including literature reviews, annotated bibliographies, and locating scholarly resources. I've created several rubrics in my professional practice, both alone and with library faculty and teaching faculty. I included the citation for an article that I wrote about an analytical rubric I created and validated and applied. This rubric was to measure citing and referencing skills of undergraduates in both APA and MLA formats. Additionally, if you have the opportunity, I encourage you to join forces with members of the teaching faculty to create rubrics to measure information literacy skills of students in a specific course. My colleague Gloria Wilson, who's a health sciences librarian, and I partnered with 3 members of the nursing faculty at LIU-Brooklyn to develop an information literacy rubric for assessing the research papers of undergraduate nursing students. And so data generated from such a partnership is really useful to both parties. For anyone new to rubrics, I have two main recommendations. I encourage you first to visit the website of Rails, Rubric Assessment of Information Literacy Skills, and you can see that the link to that is on the screen. The goal of this project is to provide both library and teaching faculty with resources for assessing information literacy skills. Of particular note is a bank of downloadable rubrics created and uploaded by librarians and other educators. I've used some of these examples as inspiration in developing my own rubrics. Additionally, I recommend checking out the robust body of scholarship on rubrics produced by Megan Oakleaf of Syracuse University and her colleagues. Thanks, Ray.
Yeah, I'm going to check out the Rails shortly during the winter break because it really sounds interesting when you described it to me.
Yes, there are many great rubrics on there. They've been very helpful to me. Okay, so this is our fourth and final poll. So the question is, how are you assessing your FYE, and what are your favorite techniques or methods to share? So we'll give you all a couple minutes to complete that.
So this is one that we need you to respond in the question box. So this would be a type-in poll, and I'll feed back to everyone what comes through.
Great, thanks
you.
Olga.
So I'm seeing Kahoot polling surveys. Pre-test and post-test with LibWizard.
Well, that's an interesting one.
Yep, reflection papers. Flip quiz. Think, pair,
I've never
share.
heard that one.
Yeah, me too.
Pathfinders is a new one.
Oh, yeah.
Looks like a lot of pre and post tests. Padlet is another new one.
Oh, Padlet? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Instagram and Smile Sheets.
Huh.
I want to learn about those.
Yeah.
Surveys. Reflection papers. Jeopardy style games. Those are some of the more unique ones. I do see a lot of trends of poll everywhere. Quick papers, like 1-minute papers at the end of one-shots. And pre and post tests.
Sounds good. Thanks, Olga.
Sure.
So we are sort of coming closer to the end of our presentation. We wanted to recommend some resources. For those who are not familiar with these publications, they are from ACRL. I've looked at classroom assessment techniques for librarians. It's really great to design and understand formative or summative assessments for instruction. So it's a really useful tool that you can consider if you haven't seen it before. Might want to just take a look at it for instruction, but I think you can also apply in other contexts too. I was thinking more about some of their examples creatively. The Library Assessment Cookbook, this one just came out recently, and I had a chance to peruse a couple of case studies that was provided there. It's part of the cookbook series under ACRL. And if you ever wanted to learn about creating stats reports or assessing donated materials or open access citation analysis, really helpful to engage and develop these activities for your own assessment. If you really still don't know where to start or having trouble, starting an assessment project, that's something you might want to consider looking as well. And this resource I wanted to mention just came out recently through ACRL. Many of you might have seen it. This is a paper from November 2017, thinking about assessment culture. So really thorough, really good information about collaborative assessment practices to support your campus. And they really cover information literacy, student learning, library space, and it really inspires you to really think how your assessment can be part of this sort of a larger study, or how you can really think about holistically assessment and how to create that culture within your library or your campus or through partnerships. As Katelyn mentioned, I think working with teaching faculty is really key to start developing that process, especially if you are an instruction librarian, or I think even collection too. If you work on subject disciplines, you might want to partner with departments and so forth and assess your collection efforts.
Okay, so we have some final thoughts concluding the webinar. The first is that assessment's very difficult, so start small. So I have a few pieces of advice. One, I definitely recommend attending some professional development events if you can. Two in particular, the Library Assessment Conference and also the Southeastern Library Assessment Conference. I attended the Southeastern Library Assessment Conference in Atlanta. I believe it's every year. Very useful if you're beginning on assessment. I also recommend seeking support and energy in your coworkers, which is what I do. We all work collaboratively on these initiatives. It's very helpful to have other people to work with. You could also, if you're brand new to this, you can try to pair up with a person who has experience in assessment as well. Another piece of data is to be mindful of student data and information. And so I especially want to mention that if you're using student artifacts within your own research, so if you're going to publish an article using, let's say, some pre-test and post-test, I definitely would recommend clearing it with your university's institutional review board, since it does pertain to student artifacts, and that's human subjects research. So that's one thing to talk about. And then Ray will talk a little bit about the next two.
Right, and so for the other two, I think we're in this culture in higher education, this climate where everything's about assessment, and there's assessment fatigue, survey fatigue, and all of that. But I think what can happen is that we have to really demonstrate our value through numerous activities, because what we're doing may not actually be working, and you don't know that unless you test it out and see what's effective and what's not. And so there's a lot of this idea that how we've been doing things should remain the same. However, I think because of the rapid changes in technology and learning and in research, we really have to be mindful of what kind of value the library can demonstrate and really support these initiatives. So I think using different kinds of tools we described today, or the resources, you might want to consider starting small or continue building on that effort, or having conversations with your campus partners, your teaching faculty, and really thinking what kind of effort the library can play to demonstrate its value in teaching, in user experience, and service, and so forth. And I wanted to mention here, this is something that I just added last minute. I had a conversation with Dr. Star Hoffman, who is the Director of Assessment and Planning at UNLV Libraries in Nevada. And this is not related to this webinar, but it was something else we were talking about. And she mentioned about following through in terms of assessment is often tricky. So what do you do with the collected data afterwards, right? And then you analyze it, where should it go? So that's something you might want to think about. You may have the data sitting there, but do you want to, like Kate mentioned, go through a protocol, an IRB, and try to get it published and all of that, or do you want to build on that? And so following through often is, from what I gather, it's very challenging because you have the data and it just sits there. But then maybe you might want to think about doing something with it or finding ways to build off of that, because otherwise, that effort is sort of a missed opportunity. So something to think about. And so we are heading into the references that we just wanted to share. I don't know if you want to say anything about this, Kate.
So every study that I spoke about today, whether it was a study that I quoted or that I included in the slideshow, should be listed on the references page. So I highly recommend checking these out. They've all been useful to me both in preparing for this webinar, and some of them I've used as inspiration already in the classroom. Some of them I will use going forward. So definitely recommend checking them out.
And as Olga mentioned, that Credo will be sharing the slides and the recorded webinar, so you can take a look at the extensive literature that Kate compiled. This is really, really good stuff that I also recommend that I'll be looking at during the break. So thank you again for listening and for participating in our polls. Really pleased with how so many people are here, and so we have time for Q&A. And if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, please feel free to share.
Thank you both. So as you said, you can submit questions into that same questions box, and I'll be fielding those right now. A couple of things that came throughout the webinar that I wanted to share as well. One of our attendees wanted to share a poster that I thought was a helpful brief overview of assessment methods. So I've just entered that. Let me enter that here. So that should come through in the chat box for you all, so you can click on that link if it's helpful. We also had questions about if the responses to the last poll, so everyone's ideas about various survey tools and such, would be shared, and we'd be happy to do that in our follow-up email. So we will send that to everyone. The slides can also be shared, so when you do receive the follow-up survey, just indicate that you want to receive slides, and we'll be happy to send those out to everyone. Okay, so moving on to a few questions for you, Ray and Katelyn. First one is, how do we apply the data to our IL teaching methods? I know it's a completely different topic, but if you have any ideas, it's worth following up with.
I'm sorry, could you please repeat that? It cut in the middle of the question.
Sure. How do we apply the data to our IL teaching methods?
So maybe I'll just say something first, and then I'll pass it to Kate if she has a response. I think the data that you have collected first, or if you haven't, you might want to just start collecting it. So if it's a preliminary study, like what Kate mentioned, having the faculty pass your survey on Google Forms to the students, 3 questions, 4 questions, you know, what's a scholarly paper and multiple choice and so forth. You can get that data and then see where, when students are coming in, if they know or don't know. Like, how do you customize that data within that workshop? So you realize a lot of students know what a scholarly article is, then you really might not have to spend a lot of time describing it. You really have to look at that data. That's how I interpret that question. Kate, I don't know if you have other comments.
Well, one interpretation I have, so I would recommend, in order to see if a specific teaching method works, one good idea, I had discussed the article that Eamon Toole and I wrote, where you have both an experimental and a control group of students, let's say first-year students, which you teach one class with, let's say for us, we use a game, so an intervention educational game, and then the control group you teach without a game, and then you do pre-test and post-test. So after that data analysis, you can see what works better. So if students in, let's say, the experimental group perform better, you can have some data to say for yourself, okay, so this is relatively effective within the classroom. So that's one way that I've applied it to refine and improve my teaching methods.
And then the data you collected, I think you can make it a chart or a graph and then communicate that with your supervisor or library administrator to get more support and to demonstrate that, look, this is working, and the faculty's input and their buy-in. We need more support to create an instruction culture or a assessment culture to understand that what you're doing, what you've already done, has measurable effectiveness.
Great, thank you. How about, what type of assessments do you use the most often, or that you find is the most effective?
So I can answer this first, Ray. So I've used rubrics the most often within my own practice. I do really want to try some of the qualitative methods that I spoke about today, but my background's in the social sciences, and so I learned a lot of the data analysis methods. So I have used the analytic rubrics. I've also created observational rubrics, which are more qualitative in nature, because you would use them to visually observe students within the classroom. That can be really helpful during an active learning-based library instruction session.
Yeah, for me, I generally go with t-tests, the pre and post, and sort of mix that up with focus groups in some other contexts, especially when I teach the first-year students on topics in, let's say, communication classes that are on controversial issues, we have a discussion. That's more like observation, less of a focus group because it's not in that, it's not as prescribed or structured. But generally, I like to try different approaches, and some of the stuff we described could be helpful. I definitely encourage everyone just to experiment and see, because it may give you new directions to your own practices.
Great. And Katelyn, going back to some of the conferences that you recommended, one of our audience members is curious about the Library Assessment Conference in Texas that's held in December. Do you have any experience with that?
Unfortunately, no, I haven't been to the Library Assessment Conference. I've had library colleagues tell me good things about it, but the one that I've been to is the Southeastern Library Assessment Conference, which is in Atlanta, and that one was definitely very useful to me. So I can't comment on Library Assessment Conference itself, except through word of mouth.
Yeah, I think that one, sorry, Olga, I'll just say that one is the ARL sponsored one, I think. And I actually talked to Dr. Star Hoffman about it, and she recommended that one. And she also mentioned that there's one called Performance and I think Evaluation. I'm probably getting it wrong, but last year it was held in Oxford. So it's an international conference that sort of rotates every other year, just like the Library Assessment Conference by ARL. So those are the two big ones. Like if you are really into assessment or you want to learn a lot about it, different methods, those are the ones to consider.
And then I just also want to mention for people who specifically work with first-year populations, this March in Cleveland in 2018, the Personal Librarian and First-Year Experienced Librarian Conference will be happening. And so I'm sure assessment-related topics will be presented. Would you agree with that, Ray?
Yeah, that's right. A lot of good stuff. And Credo will be there too, so you can talk to them and tell them how much you enjoyed this webinar.
Absolutely, we're happy to be the primary sponsor for that conference. We certainly believe in that Case Western event, so we hope to see some of you there. All right, we've got very little time left, so unfortunately we won't be able to get to any more questions, but if you do have burning questions for Ray or Katelyn, their emails are up on the screen, so do feel free to shoot them an email and chat through your topics a little bit more. But I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you, Ray and Katelyn. This was fantastic and a very engaging conversation, so we appreciate it. And just a reminder for everyone, the recording will be sent to you within 24 hours. And there will also be a short survey that pops up on your screen, and that's where you'll be able to let us know that you're interested in the slides. So keep an eye out for that email. And again, thanks to Ray and Katelyn.
Thank you very much to Olga and to Kristen and to Credo and to Ray for inviting me, and also to all of you for attending.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I hope you have a great break, and hopefully this was a helpful and inspiring webinar. If not, you can just let us know via email, and we'll be happy to chat more about it.
All right, have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.